Ruh-roh.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for You Were Elected to Lead the Living, Not the Dead, How Social Media Discourse About Nigerian Farmer-Herder Conflicts Can Help Us Better Understand Water Security. I'm Misty Matthews, the Communications Liaison for the Global Water Security Center. This webinar is presented by the Global Water Security Center in partnership with our colleagues from the University of Alabama's College of Communication and Information Sciences. The Global Water Security Center is an organization housed at the University of Alabama dedicated to translating water science for environmental security. Our aim is to serve as a bridge between scientists and key government and military officials to inform decisions at the intersection of water, health, food, and energy. You can learn more about us at ua-gwsc.org. As we begin our webinar, please feel free to submit questions at any time via the Q&A function or in chat. We'll have a dedicated question and answer time at the end of today's conversation, and the webinar will also be recorded and made available on the GWSC website and our social media platforms. With that, I'll turn it over to our Deputy Director, Kate Brauman.
Thanks, Misty. I'm Kate Brauman. I'm really excited to be here today with some folks talking about social media. And I'm a hydrologist by training. I don't really know anything about social media except that I like to tweet about water. So I'm really excited to be here today and get some insight about how we can learn about water security through social media and what social media can really tell us. So I'm going to let each of our speakers introduce themselves, but we'll have a little bit of a conversation here, and please, for you in the audience, think about questions that you have, what you're interested in knowing, because we will definitely have some Q&A time. And I'd like to start out with you, Jameson. If you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the Public Opinion Lab. How on earth did you get into studying social media in the first place, and what have you built?
Sure, Kate. Thanks for having us today. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate the work we do with Global Water Security Center as well. My name is Jameson Hayes. I'm a associate professor of advertising and public relations in the College of Communication and Information Science here at Alabama. I'm also the director of the Public Opinion Lab. You'll meet shortly Dr. Brian Britt, who's the associate director. The Public Opinion Lab is, as a lab that, yes, looks at social media, but it's really looks at social media from a data science point of view. How can we look at all the conversations going on in various media and make sense of them and come with implications that have real world impact, whether that's, advertising and public relations or something like this, trying to understand better what's going on in Nigeria and how does that conversation map across conflict and water related conflict. So we do that, in a lot of different ways, and starting from the undergraduate level and eventually at the doctoral level, develop students that put out research that hopefully will inform us by looking at what people actually say online, and the whole social conversation moved online for us to view and come with behavioral insights and hopefully actual insights that can be helpful for places like the Global Water Security Center and the audience today.
So I assume that one of the key things about using social media is you have to know what you're looking for. And so I want to toss it over to Matt Van Dyke. And if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what is the context here? How did you get connected to the Alabama Water Institute? And you want to tell folks about how we started talking?
Sure. Thanks, Kate. And I'm super excited to be here. As Kate said, my name is Matt Van Dyke. I am an associate professor of public relations in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations here at the University of Alabama. I'm also faculty lead of the College of Communication and Information Sciences, the Alabama Science Communication Initiative, and also an Alabama Water Institute faculty fellow, and big fan of Global Water Security Center and Kate and Mike and everyone over there as well. And so the way that I'm connected to this project is that I primarily do research and public engagement with science and environmental risk, and most of my environmental risk work has been in the water space. One of the things that really excites me about the project that we're talking about today and the types of approaches such as the ones that we use for this project, is we're able to answer questions that we couldn't answer otherwise. And so there's always, ideally we would be able to do this or study this or ask these questions. And, when you get into a faculty role and you realize what technology you have access to, or you kind of make your questions fit what you can do. Since I've been here and able to collaborate with Jameson and Brian and the capabilities that we have in the Public Opinion Lab, oh yeah, we can actually ask these questions and use these techniques to actually get at that. So a lot of the content, I think Jameson and Brian could talk more about all the different capabilities in terms of content that we could look at. For this specific project, we were primarily interested in English language tweets that originated in Nigeria. And so I know that's very hyper focused, but we were really interested in kind of the population of English language content using specific keywords. We'll talk about approach in a minute, but that we identified, and trying to understand the patterns and trends in discourse related to this topic.
Fabulous. And so obviously, after you find a lot of stuff, you have to analyze it. So Brian, tell us a little bit about who you are and what your piece of this puzzle is.
Sure. Thank you, Kate. And once again, to echo my colleagues, thank you very much for having the three of us here today. I do not have quite as many impressive titles as my colleagues here, but I'm Brian Britt. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations. I'm also the associate director for data analytics in the Public Opinion Lab. So I work pretty closely with Jameson on a wide range of projects. By trade, I'm a computational social scientist. So I do a lot of work looking at large scale online communication, how people self-organize in different ways. In terms of how we analyze data like what we have done for this project, as you'll see, there are many different analyses you can perform, sometimes in tandem to accomplish different types of goals. So if you're interested in understanding what people are talking about, you can conduct, say, a topic model to assess what are the distinct latent topics within the conversation. You want to know how people are talking about those topics, whether they're speaking positively, negatively, somewhere in between. You can do a sentiment analysis. If you want to know who's leading the conversation, you can do a network analysis. Really, once you've got the data, that's often the most challenging part. And then you can do whatever analysis makes sense for the specific research question that you're asking. Everything, as with any other research study, comes back to what are the RQs and what's the best way to answer those.
Well, that feels like a setup, because what I want to hear about now is, what is this project? I mean, Mike and I sat down with you guys and said, we're really interested in conflict around water. It seems like, people are talking about this. What can we learn? What's going on? People are really concerned about farmer-herder conflict. Can you solve this problem for us? Go. But a lot more happens than that. So can you talk a little bit about sort of how you approach a problem like this, and then we'll kind of get into what you found.
So I'll take first shot at that. So as you may have noticed, all three of us are in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations. Seemingly has nothing whatsoever to do with water-related conflict in Nigeria. But typically what happens is, we approach all social media data as data. And we have people come into the lab from all over campus, from often all over the country, from this grant or that grant, and say, hey, could we use social media to look at this? And we often tell them, until we tell you we can't, just assume we can do it. And we sit down and do a consult, say, here's how we would go about doing it. In this case, Matt, who's a faculty fellow at the Water Institute, said, hey, look, we're interested in looking at this, brought us in to speak with Kate and Mike, and we developed a solution for how to do it. So broad 40,000 foot view was, hey, can we use social media, whatever social media that is appropriate, to better understand how conversations unfold around water conflict and how those conversations tend to flow? And can we get some insights that we may mix with other data we have, geopolitical data, environmental data, to better understand these conversations and perhaps head off some of that conflict? So that's what we set out to do. We did some research and found that Twitter is the predominant platform, particularly Twitter in English in Nigeria, which is quite handy since all of us speak English. And we set out to design a query that could go and look for that. And we'll get more into what to think about when we're designing those queries, particularly if we're talking about what to look for in the data. It all starts with the query, and we put together a group of us that actually had some expertise in how to find the data and then how to analyze it in a reasonable way once we got it, and hopefully to develop insights that'll be useful for your audience.
Well, so putting that query together seems like that's probably the next step. And that, how do you even start thinking about that? What did you do here?
So I'll give the overview, and then Matt really was important here because Matt's the content expert, right? That's important in every project. You have to have someone who understands the context of what you want to look in. So Matt brought us several keywords, and then we looked at and said, okay, how can we logically break this up? We need to look at water-related conflicts. So we need a list of terms that reference water. We need a list of terms that reference conflict. And then once we got into the data, we also understood, okay, there's farmer-herder related conflict, and there's geopolitical things going on. So we actually developed 4 sub-lists that we end up putting together linking together to get at the data we wanted without pulling millions of units of data that were irrelevant. So Matt, do you want to expound upon that a little bit since you're the content expert?
Sure. And so, and I should clarify, I'm the content expert when it comes to, I know I'm more familiar with the terms related to water, drought, environmental risk. I had to learn and at least be arguably more expert in farmer-herder conflict in Nigeria. But like in terms of practically doing this work, it was looking at a lot of news coverage in Nigeria that talked about farmer-herder conflict, looking at in the existing academic journal articles, basically trying to look at credible sources to get a sense of what the key players that people talk about, using key terms that come up, even some cultural and political terms that you might not even necessarily think of, but if you see certain things that keep coming up, it's probably important to at least include that in an initial keyword list, and then talk with your collaborators about, should we keep this or not, or how can this work into the construction. So it really is a fun process of just trying to learn the people who are talking about this on social media. What type of language are they using to talk about these things, and trying to piece that together so that you can truly collect get the most valid snapshot of conversation over time that you can get.
So then what happens? You've got this great list of words, and then a miracle occurs.
You can give it to Brian and say, please, Brian.
Yeah, well, first you have to collect the data. In our case, I think part of the conversation has to be the availability of that data. We're lucky in that one, the data we were collecting was pre-Twitter change, but also access to Twitter. But luckily in the lab, we have access to some enterprise level tools that didn't interrupt our Twitter access, and that's still the case. Other researchers aren't quite as lucky. The changes in that format and that platform have really disrupted a lot of really great research that's been going on for years, simply because they don't have access to Twitter data anymore. And now you have to question with the changes, how valid and that's here the data is, and that's yet to be known because we haven't done those studies yet. But so for us, we took those keywords, we put them in our system, we collected the data, which is a lot of tedium that you don't really need to go into. And if people have particular questions about how to collect the data, sure, I can have that conversation. But then once we collect the data, we then turn it over to Brian, and we start doing some analyses that are higher level, going past what you can normally do in just an analytics system, where you can say, okay, this is this many positive and this many negative, to actually look at theoretical variables and take better approaches and really boil the data down and understand the conversation at a much higher level. And that's where Brian comes in.
Brian, enlighten us. What happens?
Sure. So for this project, we had a few stages that we went through with the analysis. So the first step was to understand what the major themes were in the conversation. For that, I alluded to this earlier. We constructed a topic model. Specifically, we used a latent feature Dirichlet a multinomial mixture model, which is just a gigantic word soup. I recognize that. The long and the short of it is most approaches for topic modeling are designed to handle things like presidential speeches, which tweets are not. You need specialized approaches to handle very short snippets of text that might have one latent topic, if any, within them. And so just for shorthand, LFDMM was a useful approach to get at that. So we used that to construct, it ultimately ended up being a 10-topic model of our data set of tweets. Then the three of us each independently evaluated what we thought, qualitatively, the underlying meaning of those topics actually was. Because a computer can tell you, oh, well, here's the divisions between your topics. It can't define the topics for you. It can't tell you what the actual meaning of each one is. At least current technologies can't reliably do that. So we qualitatively assessed what the top documents and the top words associated with each topic, what those really represented, came back together, discussed it as a three-person group, and ultimately established, here's what we collectively agree the meaning of each of these 10 topics are. After that, we then assessed how the representation of those topics changed over time. So was there a point in the discourse at which the conversation shifted, where all of a sudden it had gone from being primarily about these topics, and then is there an inflection point at which that changes, where now, oh, people are really more interested in this now? And so we used an approach called stepwise segmented regression to identify inflection points in the data where the conversation fundamentally shifted for a substantial period, mapped that back onto the topics themselves to see, well, these are the topics that suddenly grow in prominence. These are the topics that significantly decline by contrast. Finally, once we did that, we looked back at the original data to say, around these respective time periods where we identified breakpoints, what was happening? What were people talking about? What changed specifically in the discourse that drove the quantitative changes that we've now observed? And so we're able to connect back the actual causes of people's changing discourse on social media.
Okay, so what did you find? Like, what's the bottom line here?
So there were several key events that we identified that seemed to spur a lot of significant change. One of the ones that really stood out to me, there was a major protest that was conducted by a group of women in Nigeria, basically protesting against some of the attacks of herders on farmers, as well as some of the violence associated against women. So some of the raping and killing of women as part of those assaults, essentially saying, hey, this can't continue. There were a lot of protests that happened, as we found in Nigeria around farmer-herder conflict, but this particular protest ultimately stood out to a great degree, got a lot of media coverage, and relatedly got a lot of social media attention as well, maybe because of the unique nature of the protest in terms of what it focused on. There were a few events like that that really had a lot of significance in terms of shifting the discourse. For a lot of the conversation, it was very much, who's at fault? Who do we blame for this? Who do we not like? Because this is just a terrible situation. But there was that period where people were identifying key specific issues that were happening, and where some potential solutions started getting proposed and implemented, where the focus of the discourse shifted a little bit, at least temporarily.
So, I mean, what do you think this all means? Do you have any kind of big picture takeaways from this?
Matt, you probably have a better sense of the big picture.
Sure, I can take. I just always get excited because we're able to try to make sense of things in ways that perhaps we couldn't before. I think for me, one of the big takeaways and I'll get theoretical for a second, is using approaches like this now. Studying water security and so forth, there's been a lot of research in the past few decades to look at this stuff and at least look at the environmental drivers and do the technical risk assessment and so forth. For me, this is another way to kind of triangulate and get a sense of, so if we look at all these different indicators, perhaps environmental drivers, like I mentioned, that tells you one part of the picture. But for those who might be familiar with social amplification of risk, even if you've got this technical risk that may or may not occur, there's also the social amplification of that, which, for better or worse, is people's perception of the risk, and which could lead to crisis, right? And so by using approaches like the one here, we're able to understand and put two fingers on the pulse of what's going on in society. What, at least there are limitations, obviously, but we're putting two fingers on the pulse of what's going on Twitter and people who, use the specific keywords that we identified. But it still gives you a snapshot of what's the conversation going on, what do people care about, how are people experiencing, explicitly manifesting in terms of these different phenomena that we're studying. And so for me, it's as Brian mentioned, there was a lot of talk about environmental drivers. There was some talk about how climate change is behind these conflicts, but also a lot of discussion about poor governance and commentaries and criticisms about specific political leaders. And so you really start to get a sense of, regardless of what the technical risk is, what people perceive to be the issues and challenges, and together it tells a more comprehensive picture of perhaps where an intervention might be needed, and or where are the opportunities for cooperation and resolution.
Well, to me, that sort of starts to hit on the key here. Obviously, we want to understand these phenomena better, and the social media gives us a window into what we think people are thinking. Do we think, obviously this kind of an analysis is going to be retrospective, but do you think there's an opportunity here for using these kinds of analyses in a prospective way? Can we maybe predict places where there's going to be protests or unrest because of what we see in social media data?
To an extent, it's important to manage our expectations in terms of how well we can prognosticate. The three of us had a few conversations about this, and if we're trying to predict, for example, events of violence, that's an exceedingly difficult thing to do. In some of our conversations, I brought up an article from a few years back in First Monday that talked about how if you're trying to predict mass shootings, you'll have 100,000 false positives for every accurate prediction. It's very, very difficult to use any markers that you might choose to predict an actual tangible violent event. There may be other things we can do in terms of just seeing where the shifts are as they're occurring in terms of frustrations, and probabilistically assessing, well, here's where we think things are more likely to occur. Here's where there seem to be more signs of social unrest. It doesn't mean, oh, on February 26th, this thing is going to happen. We're probably not going to have the ability to do that, at least not anytime soon, with the level of data that we have. But we can at least, looking forward, say, well, here are warning signs. Here are things that X, Y, and Z are happening. We should probably pay extra close attention to what's happening in this nation or this region or whatever it may be around this point in time. Just in case.
So, go ahead, Jameson.
Sorry, Kate, I would just add to that. In this particular study, what we saw was the topics that remained significant and the ones that went away were very important, right? So there were 4 topics. One was placing blame, another was protest, another was evidence-based argumentation, right? So people actually trying to use reason to make sense of things, and then death and destruction. The topic that changed when certain events happened was the evidence-based argumentation went away. So you can look at that and say, okay, what are some of the indicators that show we're reaching a fever pitch, or there were particular major events that happened that made logic go out the window, and death and destruction and protests and blame went up. So as with any project of this sort, the more data you have, the more you're going to be able to say these are things we should be watching for. So the more projects we do in different contexts, we can triangulate and say this is getting more reliable. But to Brian's point, we have to be careful about saying we're going to predict on a certain date this is going to happen for sure. But in this case, it was very interesting to see, okay, what are the things that happen, and then all logic goes out the window, and we're not having a useful discourse that can actually solve the problem.
So, also looking at some of the questions that are coming in, I'm really wondering about how generalizable this is. How specific are you able to do research? So someone asked, can you delineate what country or what city tweets are coming from? And if you are really specific, then do you think you can take findings like this and, do they also apply to Kenya, where people are concerned about farmer-herder conflict? Do they also apply to Niger? So how do we think about like the specificity and the generality of something like this?
Who wants to take? I can do, if y'all want to talk about the practicality of collecting and analyzing, I could talk about implications.
Sure. Well, practically, and thanks, Karen, for your question on this. Yes, we were able to pinpoint only tweets that originated from Nigeria. Now, that's not to say that when we go, the next step in the analysis is looking at things like what are the media that people are linking to and entering to the conversation. It's very well could be that those media come from outside of Kenya. So we're not there yet in this project, but all the tweets that were sent did originate from Kenya, and we can do that. So that helps with at least knowing that they're all relevant to Kenya. The generalizability, is going to be a bit tougher the more we add projects. So we're hoping this will lead to a larger project where we're looking at transboundary conversations and how things that happen in Nigeria affect Kenya, and places where borders, water basins land on borders. And I think that's the next step, where the more we do this analysis in different contexts, as with any research, the more we'll be able to speak of generalizability. But in terms of the practicalities, that's how it worked. We were able to get only people from Nigeria, although there is a possibility that media could have been linked to, and we haven't done that analysis yet.
And I would just, Jameson described it perfectly in my opinion. And I think just to add to that, for me at least, the going through and doing this project really underscores to me the benefit and the necessity of doing a hyper local look, at least regional and or country level, and within those boundaries, so that we can then have a sampling of cases that we can then, as Jameson said, begin to generalize from that, because there was a lot of nuance that you would think, if you would probably assume, but I just didn't realize until we got into the weeds that how important that's going to be moving forward.
Well, I suspect you're bringing up nuance as part of the answer to this question, but, using social media, using artificial intelligence to query things that are in social media seems like very hot right now. So why can't I just, hire an undergrad that's taken a comp sci class in AI and like throw them at a problem like this? Like talk to me a little bit about sort of where some of the challenges and complications come into play.
So part of what if we're talking about if we're talking about analyzing the data, why we can't just say, oh, AI, go do this. Part of where the challenge comes in is there's still a theoretical piece to this, where we do have to have some understanding of, from a social scientific standpoint, what's actually happening in the discourse. If you want to develop a pure black box to correlate X events with Y events, you might be able to do something like to the effect of just having a CS person take the helm and run everything. But you lose a theoretical understanding of A, why that's happening, and B, if you try to do that blindly, your model's probably going to have its own problems. If you don't understand, well, here are the types of things that will ultimately lead to conflict. Here are the sorts of things that exacerbate existing tensions. If you just try to have a computer blindly do it without some level of theoretical understanding, the model that's developed is likely to be rather imperfect, rather inefficient in nature. And so there are issues where if you have an incomplete understanding of the social dynamics of what's happening, a naive model may not perform all that well in practice.
And Matt, you talked about spending a long time developing your search list. What happens if you don't have the right words, or you're more like, if you just took all of the tweets from Nigeria from this time period and analyze them, Brian, with your tools, like, do you get the same thing? Do you get nothing? What happens?
So I actually asked that question. I'll let Jameson and Brian address it.
So the reason I said everything starts with the query is because the query is the basis for everything that's going to happen after that. So if you go too broad with the query, then you're letting in things that are irrelevant. If you go too narrow, the danger of going narrow, and we went pretty narrow on this, is if you miss something that is relevant, you don't have that to analyze, right? If we were to go, for example, a lot of what we do is network analysis to understand who are the players in this conversation, which we will probably do as an extension of this project, to understand what media sources, for example, may be driving the conversation. Are there influencers within the conversation on the ground that we need to be paying attention to? We can't do that if we don't have the full network. If we miss a keyword, then that part of the network's just unknown to us, and we don't know that it's not there. So that's why it's really important. Oftentimes we start broad because we can always get rid of data, but even that becomes more complicated. So for example, we pulled 2 data sets for this study. We pulled one simply on conflict in Nigeria. And then we pulled one specifically on water-related conflict in Nigeria, because that's what global water security was particularly interested in. But we still have that whole other data set, and it'll be very interesting to see what topics in that larger data set map onto the water-related topics and how they play together once we start looking at that. So that's why.
Because I want to know now.
So I'll add to Jameson's point here. Part of why we didn't just do the larger data set that has all conflict, that data set was something like 50 times, I believe, as large as the data set we ended up analyzing, which was still perfectly manageable in terms of an analysis. The problem is that we realized the water-related conflict that we were really interested in for this project would have just been washed out, no pun intended. Whatever topics were important for that discourse, for water-related conflict in particular, probably wouldn't have shown up at all, or at least to a very minor degree. There would maybe been shades of it at most if we'd analyzed the full data set with a lot of things that were not relevant to water-related conflict. So for understanding water-related conflict specifically, we had to circumscribe the query very carefully. And so that's where query construction becomes vitally important, is in dealing with problems like that.
So what you're saying is that the beauty and the tragedy of social media data is that there's a lot of it.
Therein lies the problem of big data. Yes.
I'll just to add to that as well. I think that's why, to Jameson's point about being careful and thoughtful with the query construction, is because when I, for example, started to become the expert in this, I've in thinking about the complexities and the nuances associated with this, and why probably a hyper-local regional perspective is necessary, is because none of this happens, none of these dynamics play out very cleanly the way that we would like them to fit into figure one, right? So when you start looking at discourse, you're like, oh, the terrorism is a big part of this, or these, militia groups, or whatever it happens to be. You realize very quickly that there are some other things going on here besides just water and or other things, right? And so it really becomes, you kind of have to immerse yourself into whatever that space is and try to tease that stuff out. And it's to Brian and Jameson's point, it's fun, but it can be nerve-wracking. You just want to make sure you get it right.
So then as you're taking these queries, you've got these data and you're doing analysis on them. Brian, some of the things you talked about have long multisyllabic names. Are these kinds of analyses that you're talking about, have these been standardized? Is this new stuff that you're developing? How do you sort of know how to interpret what you're seeing in these data?
So to answer the first part about that, some analyses have been fairly standardized, well established. There are topic modeling approaches. The gold standard, latent Dirichlet allocation, which I recognize is still very multisyllabic. Latent Dirichlet allocation, for example, goes back 20 years. So it's pretty well established. If you look at the academic literature, it's got like tens of thousands of citations. It's been used a lot in a wide variety of domains. But as I noted earlier, that approach was not used in this study because it wouldn't have worked well in this study with the particular data set we were analyzing. It's good with like presidential speeches and the like. Many of the analyses that work well for the unique characteristics of social media data and the unique research problems that we're addressing now, like identifying specific changes in longitudinal data that are highly volatile and so forth, require analyses that are frankly a little more novel, a little bit more cutting edge, and a little bit less established in the literature. And so you do have to have some willingness to step outside the box. You're not going to be able to answer research questions like this in the manner that you'd probably like using the things that are available in a drop-down menu in SPSS. It requires a little bit more exploration than that to be able to achieve some of these goals. And there are pros and cons to that. It means certainly that you're integrating cutting edge knowledge in academic research and academic and professional research, but it also means maybe you're taking a little bit more of a risk by using an analysis that's not been as widely vetted, that hasn't been used 10,000 times. So there are trade-offs to certainly bear in mind with the choices that we're making along the way in the research process.
So we're going to move into Q&A now. So there are some questions in the Q&A already, and I want to encourage the audience to ask more questions. But starting at the top, there's sort of a real obvious transition, I think, into this, which is about bias. And I both love what you're doing and it makes me nervous, right? It's everything from, are you choosing the right keywords, to what's the interpretation that you're doing? So how are you thinking about bias? How are you trying to control bias?
So yes, bias is always a critical consideration, and we try to get as representative of a sample as we can. Anytime we are looking at, well, what are the people thinking? What are the people saying? Everything always comes back to, Are we looking at data that are actually representative of what we care about? Are we looking at conversations on, are these particular social media conversations actually representative of what people on the ground in Nigeria are thinking, saying, feeling? And there are limits to that. I don't think any of us post every single thing we're thinking to Twitter or to Facebook or wherever. If you do, frankly, I pity you. Hopefully most people have at least some things that they're not putting out online 24/7. So there are always going to be some gaps between what we see in our more behavioral data, what people choose to express versus their innermost thoughts and feelings. We get as close as we can, and that's frankly true of just about any research. Social, scientific, or in the natural sciences, we're always trying to get as close as we can to the actual phenomena of interest that we're trying to evaluate. But there are always going to be some disparities, however great or however slight, between our data and those actual phenomena. So the goal is just to minimize that as much as possible. I think a lot of that, I would say, comes back to what's the source of the data and how appropriate is the query that you've constructed. In our case, we focused on English language tweets in Nigeria because, as Jameson noted earlier, Nigeria is heavily English speaking. Puts a lot of their social media activity is on Twitter. That does not encompass all social media activity in Nigeria. There are certainly some tweets that are being made in other languages. There are certainly some posts that are made on other social media platforms. And of course, there are a lot of things that they're choosing not to say on social media. Maybe they talk about them with their friends and neighbors, but they're not going online for one reason or another. There are inherent limitations here. What we're ultimately doing in this study is getting a snapshot of at least a portion of what's happening. It's a window into the interpersonal sociological dynamics at hand, as opposed to those dynamics themselves. We're getting a window, and that's as close as we can get, but it's still meaningful. It's still valuable for our purposes.
So go ahead, Jameson.
I would also add that once we get the data, there's also potential for bias. Anytime you have a qualitative opponent, for example, or for that matter, the choices you make in terms of how you analyze the data quantitatively, right? In this case, we did the best we could to limit that, right? Because even the topics which we all triangulated between the three of us, we did that based on topic loadings and item loadings that showed how closely these tweets loaded together onto a topic to say they're a cohesive topic, and then we analyzed as such, as opposed to saying, I think this tweet's important, I think this tweet's important. And then we used social scientific approaches to triangulating, so we all analyzed the data separately and then came together. But even still, the three of us may have three other researchers may have interpreted those tweets slightly different than we did. That's just true of any research, but I do think we did the best we could, but absolutely, as Brian points out, it doesn't matter what type of research you're doing, you always need to do the best you can to limit that bias and acknowledge the potential of that bias, regardless of what you're doing.
What about with the keywords, Matt? Is that something that you pay attention to?
Definitely, and I think that's what stressed me out, because part of it is you want to Brian's point, you want to make sure that with the limitations of an approach like this, you want to maximize the benefits of the benefits. And so I think that's why I spent so much time scouring over news articles, academic articles, trying to get a sense of what the actual language it is that they're using. And again, even if there are colloquial terms that I'm not necessarily familiar with, I would even jot down notes and say, so that I could come back to the group and say, okay, this term keeps popping up, it seems to be this, or so if we see that, it's going to be related to this, and we'll have to figure out how it relates to other things. But another thing that I don't know the extent to which Brian talked about this, but I think one of the benefits of the approach that we use is that it actually, rather than kind of content analyzing words in isolation, the approach that Brian uses to analyze this actually looks at how the words are associated with each other. So we do have a sense of how these words operate together rather than in isolation, just saying, that murder happened 20 times in the data set. That's not what we're looking at.
And so, Matt, you've been talking about using traditional media and research papers to look for the words. Y'all also mentioned looking as like a next step, you could look at what these tweets link out to, what other kinds of media sources. So is that a way you sort of another kind of triangulation that you do to understand sort of what this means?
I think so. Jameson, do you want to talk about maybe Sprinkler? Would you use Sprinkler for that, or?
No, I think we would mine those from the existing tweets. Sprinkler is really just our collection platform. But we can do network analyses to understand how these different media sources within the data may be impacting the overall conversation. To one of, I believe, Penny's question as well, it kind of links to this, which is, we can also track particular members of the conversation. We've done other studies that are more advertising based, but absolutely we could say, okay, let's pull out the people that are involved in the conversation and track, how their conversation flows. It would be fascinating to see if some of those people switch from evidence-based arguments to losing their mind and going with death and destruction all of a sudden. It's certainly another paper, but it's absolutely something we could do. So there's tons of data in there that we can mine and say, okay, how does this impact the conversation? That could be, which media are driving the conversation, but also how people are changing within the conversation and how they communicate after certain events as well.
Right. So it's not just how the overall conversation is changing over time, but actually longitudinally, how even down to how are individuals changing their patterns over time.
Yes, it would be it's going to be laborious, but we could absolutely do that for sure. I think it's also important to note that some of the things that we saw change the conversation were political and environmental variables. That, I think, is where the real contribution can become. How can we add social media data and insights with those variables we're already looking at in terms of conflict and water-related conflict? And can that give us a better better predictors and measures for what's going on the ground? I think that's the next step. And that also gets at the question about spatial, right? In this particular context, we didn't collect in a way that we can zero in on what city, for example, or what area this came from. We could recollect the data using a different approach and absolutely get more granular in terms of what area, for example, of Nigeria the conversation came from. We didn't collect it that way, but in doing that, we could break those things out. And I think it could be an interesting approach to this, simply because one of the topics we saw was location-based events. People were talking about things that happened in certain areas of the country. I will note, though, that topic was not significant. So all the same things were happening in every area of the country, even though they were talking at that point about particular areas that they were happening. So that may be a middle answer. Yes, we could do that. No, we did not do that in this particular case, and we'd have to completely redo the project in order to do that. But thank you so much for the question.
Well, so maybe this is a naive question, but why not just collect sort of all of the possible data about every single tweet that you pull?
So as a first point, just to expand upon the points that James was making, I'll add, if we were interested in getting data on where is the individual who made this tweet, specifically where are they located? So longitude and latitude, getting the actual geolocation coordinates, we could do that to an extent. The problem is, if you look at Twitter, for example, Twitter provides geolocation information, but the majority of tweets do not have that because the users haven't enabled it, or they've chosen to mask their location. You can do things, frankly, if you want to appear in a different place than you are. But the bigger problem is just the data that doesn't have that information, where if you've only got, say, 5% of your tweets actually have geolocation information, then you're missing a whole lot of the conversation by choosing only to focus on that. So that's a pretty big problem. that may vary from platform to platform in terms of the availability of geolocation data. And so depending on where people are actually going to talk about these issues in a particular country or region, that may be more viable. If they're going to another platform that does provide extensive geolocation information as a requirement for every single contribution, sure, that becomes a much more possible research study to conduct. Not so much if you're looking at Twitter data. I would really caution people about relying too heavily on that, because you're going to miss a whole lot of data that way. As for why we don't just collect everything we possibly can, frankly, it's because data challenges. If you do have a really large set of data, say hundreds of thousands of observations, and you're then saying, okay, instead of collecting 5 or 8 columns of data, let's collect 100 columns. All of a sudden, you're talking about a data set that's much more unwieldy, and it's wasteful because you've then got a lot of junk that you're never going to end up actually using. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to collect what you actually need for the study you're planning to conduct, so that you're not wasting resources collecting through whatever API or other service you're using, because you may be burning through tangible resources there. You're not exhausting hard drive space on your own side. You're not spending months potentially of additional time collecting those data that, again, you don't need all those excess columns. Understanding what the research question is that you're actually trying to answer, and what information is really critical to answer that question, is vital before you do the data collection.
So we have a great question on here that I feel like combines the bias questions with some of the spatial questions, which is about idiomatic differences, even within a country. So this was a question about differences between US and Nigerian English, but I can also easily imagine that within country, one would see idiomatic differences. How do you even think about dealing with problems like that?
Brian, you want me to take this one?
If you want.
Sure. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. If you're using a dictionary-based approach, where essentially you're taking the information and you're running it through a dictionary, then you may have trouble, right? Because that dictionary is going to be based on certain ways that certain areas use language. Same thing with sentiment. Sentiment is a famous example of being really hard to judge, right? And the reason is because the way we say something in the US and say Nigeria or UK could be completely different, which means the algorithm can't tell those differences. The way we approach this project, there is no issue. And the reason is because there was no dictionary. We simply, the analyses we did a computational look and simply counted the number of words and also tallied the number of topics and gave us factor loadings. We then were able to look at it. Now, if we looked at the data and said, I have no idea what they're saying because they say something completely different, then we would be in trouble. But luckily, that part wasn't done by an algorithm. The algorithm simply said, here's what loads together, and here are the top terms. So we were able to avoid that concern here. But certainly, if you're ever doing sentiment analysis, it's a huge problem.
Yeah, to sort of expand a little bit on that. So the approach that we're using assesses not just what the words themselves are, but how they relate to one another, how they're used in tandem in particular ways. And so to put this in perspective, I've done analyses before, topic modeling approaches, a variety of types, where there may be documents in the data set that have different languages altogether. And it's fascinating to me to see words from different languages end up in the same topic. And I had to look up what these different words are. They may be like Chinese characters or Japanese characters or other things that are not even English characters with which we're familiar. And the words are amazingly like the same within the topic. The algorithms are able to identify that based upon the ways in which they're actually used in the discourse. So by taking more of a bottom-up approach where you look at the data set itself and let meaning and then the identification of topics emerge from that, you're able to avoid some of the problems that would otherwise emerge if you imposed, well, here are the words we know in the English language and here's how we know they're used. The problems that could emerge due to idiomatic usage, like Win-Win was talking about in her question.
So we also had a question about sort of positive sentiment. And I mean, we started this out talking about conflict, which definitely brings us down a negative road. But, you know, as you think about, did you see anything in the data with positive sentiment, positive shifts, as well as negative? And sort of how do you think about positive differently if you do than negative?
So one of the key inflection points that we observed in the data was a moment at which portion of the conversation shifted from really talking about, who's at fault, who do I blame for this, to, oh wait, the government's trying, this solution. They're trying to re-energize these basins. Here are things that are actually happening that might have a positive effect. Oh, there was this policy that was adopted 15 years ago that was since abandoned, and now the government's returning to it to try to get those benefits back. There was some hope that emerged at various points. Now, this unfortunately happened right around the end of our data collection period because it was right around 2022. So we don't know how all that turned out because the world doesn't know how all that turned out yet. It will be interesting looking forward to see over time, does that hope pan out? But there was the emergence of hope that coincided with a decline in this antagonistic blaming that we saw in the data set. And so I'd be very interested to see what effects that has both long-term on the discourse as well as any possible effects that it has potentially on the violence itself.
So last question, and either this is a challenge or a gimme. What about some of these new language processing models like ChatGPT? Are you all about to be out of a job?
I mean, maybe, who knows? I mean, honestly, is anyone really secure right now? I did see a question in the chat asking about whether we could use large language models as inputs in the analysis. I would probably say LLMs, I don't think are going to be useful for that purpose. They're very helpful for constructing language that seems to be somewhat natural in nature, at least to a relatively untrained eye. It seems to be human-like. But if you've noticed, a lot of issues have come out in recent months where people are realizing, oh, when a large language model, an LLM, constructs a sentence or tries to write a page of an essay, it's often wrong. It often says a lot of things that are incorrect. It may even construct entire citations and references that don't even exist to try to support points that are completely off the wall, even if at a glance they look right. And so if we're trying to use large language models as a means to understand what's actually being said, I mean, it's constructing flawed arguments already, just based on being asked simple questions. It's probably not going to be able to correctly interpret what's happening in textual discourse. If you want that, then what we're really looking for is something much more akin to the holy grail of natural language processing, where the machine actually understands on some level what's happening in the discourse beyond simple recognition of patterns of words and phrases and so on. That's probably what we'd really be looking for at that stage, and we're not there yet. People disagree on whether we'll ever get there. I tend to think at some point we will. I don't know when. It might be tomorrow. It might be a few decades from now. And then ask me about my job.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. We're going to keep you all employed. We at the Global Water Security Center are super thrilled about this work that you've been doing, but also I speak for myself, but based on the questions from the audience, I think that it's really true that this is exciting. This is a whole different kind of data than a lot of us have thought about before. And it's really neat to get some understanding about what what the work you do really is. So Matt, Jameson, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a ton of fun. Plus moderator's privilege, I get to ask all the questions I want. But I know who the real boss is. So I'm going to turn this back over to Misty Matthews to sign off today and not run over time with all of our audience. So thank you again. I really appreciate your being here.
Thanks, Kate. And just to echo Kate's sentiment, thanks so much, Matt, Brian, and Jameson. For our attendees, once you exit the webinar, you should see a survey pop up in your web browser. It would help us out a lot if you respond to let us know how you enjoyed today's event and also to help inform our future programming. So all responses are anonymous. So if you'd like more information about the Global Water Security Center, you can find us online at ua-gwsc.org. And if you'd like to learn more about the University of Alabama's Public Opinion Lab, you can visit publicopinionlab.ua.edu. One last time, thanks for joining us and hope you have a great afternoon.